Hi everyone. Some of you know me, but my name is Lorenzo Béatrix. I work as a curator and a researcher, mainly in Paris. And I got interested in the notion and the very broad term of land art and its interaction with sounds. And that's what I wanted to discuss with you today. But before that, I wanted to thank the whole Residency Limited team, David, of course, Natalie, Mariko, Marco, all the people that I've interacted with. I feel very lucky to having this kind of support, which I think is pretty rare, especially in New York. So to tell you more about what I'm interested in, here I'm referring about Soundscape, which is, as you will see, a very common term. But I am going to use it to define the various use of sounds and music in relation with the environment. And we are looking at soundscape from the land art perspective, which are generic terms that designate various artistic movements, various atmosphere that we're interested in earth and nature from a very material, sometimes point of view, or something much more spiritual. And my residency here in New York was about understanding how soundscape and land art could interact and how we can understand nature from a different perspective through sound. This is a very scary diagram, but those are all the terms that navigate around the very broad term of land art. Most of those terms, maybe you're familiar with, are things that developed in the 60s and the 70s, especially in the US. I'm thinking of minimalism that can refer to both music and also conceptual art. Earth art, which designates this very particular art scene and artist, Walter de Maria, Robert Smithson, Michael Heizer, that coined the term in the end of the 60s and who were interested in nature from a very materialistic and almost masculine perspective. And then we have something different, which is more recent, but also rooted in the 60s and the 70s, which is everything around eco-art, eco-aesthetics. I had a wonderful discussion with Béatrix about that yesterday. And that also encompasses land reclamation. So today we're going to do a bit of everything, a bit of all of this. And I wanted to begin with looking at some theory. I'll try to be very brief about this. The starting point of sound as a material for artists really begin in the 20th century, especially with Luigi Russolo. Maybe you're familiar with his work. And he coined the term the art of noises, the terms art of noises, because he was interested in how we can challenge the notion of music by incorporating various sounds within composition. He was a great influence for Stockhausen, of course, La Montiong, that we're going to discuss a bit later. So that's early 20th century. And then, this is a bit of a jump in time. Raymond Murray Schaeffer was interested in how soundscape could be used as a sort of compositional element within the environment and how we can understand the spaces and also the preservation of certain areas, natural areas, through sound. This is really the kind of starting point of my reflection. It's a very interesting publication that I really encourages you to read. And then this is more philosophical, but that's also an interesting framework. Looking at nature and looking at sounds, we have to see it also from a postmodernist perspective. Here talking about the writing by Félix Guattari, The Three Ecologies. And this is interesting because Félix is sort of devising ecologies in a very interesting way when we look at sound. He thinks of ecology as something mental, and that is very interesting for us because it encourages us to do some deep listening and to pay attention to the various sounds, things that Luigi Russolo was interested about. You know, cracklings, the sounds of nature, things that we think are part of our environment, our everyday life, but are actually something that is part of ecology. And it's also interesting for us because in a more land care and land reconnection point of view, he is also thinking about sound as a sort of non-intrusive form of art. And what he believed is that sound and land can interact, and that we as humans can play a very specific role into paying attention to them, looking at their essence, and sort of understanding ecology within a sort of interconnected framework of atmospheres, of places, of sounds, and not being the center of it, but more, around this sort of new framework. So that's for the more philosophical point of view. And then obviously, it's interesting to discuss nature with Lucie Lippard. You are familiar, I'm sure, with her work, but she got interested in conceptual art in the 60s. And one of the lesser known publications that she wrote is The Lure of the Local. And that's something very interesting for me because it examines how sounds and nature can be so specific to the feeling of home. And speaking about care, this is also something that we will discuss later when looking at artworks. But there's this kind of approaching certain sites as homes, as places where you inhabit and that you need to take care of. And there's this sense of belonging. She's talking a lot about belonging, which I think is really beautiful when looking at nature. And then this is the last one, but maybe the most important one recently, Eco-Aesthetic by Malcolm Miles. So here Malcolm Miles is not talking about ecology as a sort of, he's not perceiving nature as a sort of transcendental beauty, and he's not looking at works, an environment as something that artists were interested in from a materialistic point of view in the first place. He's more looking at how we can see works as departure points to understand something broader. And we're going to discuss a bit later this notion of expanded field that is very interesting when we understand the history of sculpture and how it interacted with nature at a sort of point in the 60s and the 70s in the US. So this is for the very theoretical point of view. And now this is more about the general context of the beginning of this interaction between sound and nature. And this is kind of paradoxical because the first starting point is, of course, the silent spring, the not so silent spring, actually, that you're familiar with, I'm sure. Written in 1962, it was a sort of scientific examination of a legal case and a land use case, but it became this sort of starting point for a broader discussion about our role with environment, our place as human beings, and of course, raising awareness with the beginning of ecological issues that were taking place in the 60s. And that's interesting because it's definitely linked with a more local issue taking place in Soho, which is the beginning of the Lower Manhattan Expressway. So this is very, very much focused on New York. But that's going to be very interesting when we look at how New Yorkers and New York artists were able to understand their city from both a sound and a land perspective. This is also in this sort of, shift in consciousness about the use of urban setting and the use of land is also the time during which the whole Earth catalog was published in the late 60s. For those who are not familiar with the Old Earth catalog, it is currently exhibited at the Whitney. It's a fantastic work because it's about how we can build a future as human being. And it was supposed to be at the beginning a sort of very affordable magazine that you could purchase and explaining to you all the various ways of using land, using objects. And it was really meant to be a sort of encyclopedia. But it's also a sort of symptom of how land was not really understood from an ecological point of view, but more as an environmental curious point of view. And going back to the Lower Manhattan Expressway, of course, it triggers a lot of questions about the use of land and how we can stop certain projects that were, land intensive or, too disruptive in terms of urban planning. Sorry, yes. And then, of course, taking place in Soho at the time was the very famous 112 Green Street initiatives, started with Tina Giroir, Gordon Miller Clark, Susan Harris, all those artists interested in how we can use sort of experimental spaces and abandoned places to create something experimental. And that can also be a sort of freedom space for artists, not only from a very spatial point of view, but also a mental point of view. How do you create this sort of belonging to a scene, of sharing experiences, of being a community in Soho at the time? And so those are two famous examples of 112 Green Street. This is Wallpaper by Gordon Miller Clark, and 4 Stages. That's also currently on view in New York. I'll talk about that later, but it's a fantastic exhibition. Tina Giroir is featured in currently in New York. So this is alternative sites. And this is also interesting because it's also the moment from a more institutional point of view during which earth art was developed. And here we're more talking about artists such as Robert Morris, Robert Smithson, Michael Heizer, Richard Serra, all those artists that begin to look at how gallery and the outside world sort of interact when you are an artist interested in nature. Where do you place your work? And of course, Robert Smithson has this whole dialectic of site, non-site. What kind of relationship do we have with the work from displacements, from various places? How do we connect with, a sort of idealized view of a site? And then how do we interact with the material that is in front of us? This is the idea of the piece, which is in this photograph. I did one gallery. So here we're more looking at the expanded field of earth art and land art. This is a very famous piece that I like called Continuous Project Alto Daily by Robert Morris. He actually titled his entire life Continuous Project Alto Daily in this sense of building something that was more about himself than about the artwork, and how art can be a sort of experience that can involve the spectator, the artist, and the site as a common place. This is 1969. And then looking at the expanded field, there is also something much more interesting for us, because it's the beginning of sound experimentation and electronic music, especially on the West Coast. This is a photograph of Suzanne Ciani. She is an amazing artist. She's still performing electronic music, and she was really at the beginning of this scene of electronic music, of synthesizers on the West Coast. She worked with Don Buchla on the first analog synthesizer, and she got interested in how can modular synthesizers can reproduce or can complement natural works and natural experiences that we have. And there's this very famous quote: "The ocean waves are my mantra. I live with them now, and they were the inspiration for my first album, 7 Waves." So this is this kind of beginning of sound experimentations with land from a also spiritual point of view. And this is a work very dear of mine from Gordon Miller Clark called Tree Dance. And here we have this sort of opposition between something very machine-like and something much more organic. Gordon Miller Clark was interested in how you can inhabit a natural space as a human in a very informal way. So this is, yes, a photograph of the work. And then I wanted to show you a short video. I hope it's gonna work. Nope, it's not. Let me see. Just cutting sound. And so the work was about how do we, sorry, yes, there we go. How do we climb? How do we structure something which is both human and both natural? How both are interacting. it's a fantastic work. It was kind of a protestation also about this sort of political negativity towards nature at the time. It was 71. But yeah, anyway, that's a few minutes long. That's the spirit. To learn more about the beginning of sound, and especially about women composers, there is this great documentary that I really enjoyed watching, called Sister with Transistors. It was done by Lisa Rovner, and it's narrated by Laurie Anderson, that you're familiar with, I'm sure. And it's about the very beginning of the West Coast scene for American composers, and also the interaction with performance art at the time. And how do we create this sense of belonging to a community of artists interested in nature, interested in sound, interested in how do we question our place as composers. This is a fantastic documentary. And now we are going into what really interests us, is the sort of beginning of vibration studies. How do we make sense of a place from a very materialistic and almost scientific point of view, having this quest of frequency. The first work that I wanted to discuss with you is Max Neuhaus' The Times Square piece, that is still existing today. It was originally from one side, but it was displaced to Times Square. Its existence is made possible by the DIA Foundation. And it's very interesting because it's really the first work of art who was meant to be shared by everyone walking in the street. And there's this very interesting experience that you can have with the work that can be both very intimate. If you come very early in the morning in Times Square, everything is very silent and you just have this sort of buzzing noise, this sort of drone noise, and this is the piece. Or you can come in the middle of the day and you will hear absolutely nothing. And there's this kind of experience that you have with the work and it's depending on the space and the actual site that I think is really interesting. And from a very scientific point of view, this is an oral topography of the work. And I wanted to quote Max Neuhaus because he said, traditionally composers have located the elements of a composition in time. One idea which I'm interested in is locating them instead of in space and letting the listener place them in his own time. Of course, for Times Square, this is kind of symbolic. But the oral topography is telling us that you appreciate the work of art in many, many ways. The very dark areas are the low frequency, and then you move on to things that are high frequency. And you have this sort of landscape in its own, which is featured in a broader landscape, which is very interesting. And then building on that same idea, I talked a bit about La Montiong last week, but this is the Dream House. It still exists today. You can experience it. It's on Church Street. I think it's 275. And this is really how you can perceive New York as a frequency. La Montiong was a founding member of minimalism. He worked alongside his wife Marine Zazila, who was also a composer, performance artist, painter, and they both were interested in how do we make sense of New York as a calm and meditative space. And they created this sort of concept called Dream House, that was supposed to be a place of meditation, but built on something that is from the space it inhabits. And so La Montiong and Mazazila sort of recorded the frequency of New York, and they use oscillators, big oscillators in a Dream House in New York, specifically tuned to reproduce the electrical frequency of New York. This is the 7.23 hertz low frequency. And then he creates a sort of additional layer with the fifth harmonic, which is supposed to be more calm and more meditative. So creating a work of art within a space, using the space with drone music. And then now that we are speaking about energies and frequencies, I've also briefly mentioned Bernie Krause last week, but I wanted to go more in depth. Bernie Krause was a composer in the 50s, 60s, and 70s. He began also by using synthesizers to create ambient sounds. And then in the 70s, he had this sort of very strong feeling of being connected to nature. He is still very young at the time. He is anxious, and he feels that music can be a way of making sense of his own place within nature. And yes, this is the code I used for him. For my first field recording in the late 60s, I had just discovered a portable stereo analog tape recorder, combined it with a decent pair of stereo mics, found a quiet, accessible park nearby, tuned on the instrument, and voila. The forest landscape in my earphones was so spectacular and tranquil, with an instant calming effect, that I decided then and there to find a way to devote the rest of my working life to capturing those kind of sounds. And that's exactly what he did. And now, today, he is building the nature sound archives, going into the forest, going into the jungle, and recording all the endangered species, both for the animals and also the natural elements, plants, atmospheres, certain sites. And he basically created a sort of bioacoustic artworks in the 80s, 90s, and he's still working. So this is also another way of understanding how sound can record and pay homage to nature by creating an archive. Another composer that I wanted to tell you more about, lesser known than Bernie Krause, is Ania Lockwood. She had the same kind of destiny because she was first interested in this sort of compositional perspective with materials. At the beginning, she used glass to create concerts in specific spaces on the West Coast and then in New York. And then she created more performative pieces, the piano transplants that you see here. And this is, yes, more performative. But what's interesting is, yeah, those are images of the glass concert. So she's really using the material and creating this space, which is fascinating. And then she moved on to something more about the deep listening of nature. She created various works. The first one was World Rhythm and the sound map of Hudson River. And she is using microphones and specific tools to record nature and to create music from the recordings. And she's still composing, which I also think is amazing. And she was first and foremost interested in water. So she created specific tools to do some deep recording of water in the US. And now moving on to something a bit more spatial. Maybe you know Nancy Holt. She was a fantastic American artist, both conceptual and very often associated with land art. She was also married to Robert Smithson. And she was a sculptor. So this is Sun Tunnels, the most kind of famous artwork that she created in the Nevada desert. But the first interesting piece that she created in the middle of the 60s was about sound. She was using sound in a sort of, let's say, information way. She basically tape recorded some of her own walks with Robert Smithson throughout certain sites. And this is Stone Ruin Tour, an artwork that she created in 1967. And there's this interesting sort of interaction between her own voice, the sounds of the elements around her, because it's a natural site, and then the sort of score that she created out of this recording. So everything is about information, really. And then after this, she got more interested about the use of sound also in informational way, but more on the urban setting. So this is another piece that she created a bit later, Tour of the John Weber Gallery. And it's related to her poem phase in her work. And she described this work as such: tour where you looked closely at the environment, at all the cracks and the stains on the floor, looked at the window and certain things like chimneys, flues, brick walls, etc. And also looked at the other art in the gallery, including my East-West locators, without giving any special emphasis because they were art. And so she's both referencing her own creation, her own artworks, the space, how humans inhabit the space, how we interact with the gallery setting. So this, yeah, I'm a huge admirer of tour of John Weber Gallery. I find it's quite fascinating. And then looking at land art through sound, we also need to pay attention to how rhizomic the experience of land art is, taking into consideration that a land artwork is many things. The journey to the site, the oral history that you've heard from the work, the written sources that were later created about the site, the scientific studies of its evolution, the potential images that you saw of the work, and first and foremost, the experience of the site in itself. And sometimes those works of land art are not recorded or not understood from a sound perspective. And this is something that really interested me because when you look at Spiral Jetty is many things. It's the site, it's the movie that Robert Smithson did, it's the text that he wrote about the piece. So it's many works within one work, and yet there is no sound of Spiral Jetty. We have no collection of how Spiral Jetty sounds. What the small cracks within the salt around the shapes, the desert-like roads when you're coming to the site. This sort of sound experience is not existing, and this is something that I want to pursue, creating this sort of complementary experience to the work that can pursue and deepen our understanding of the artwork of the site. And so doing this, I got interested in Alan Sonfist Time Landscape, which you could still experience in New York. It's right next to NYU. And this is a very interesting work because Alan Sonfist almost took 10 years to create the entire project. He was 18 at the time. And he convinced the Met to support this project, which was a rehabilitation of an original land. And so he worked with scientists to find all the natural species of trees, specific plants on the floor that were present before New York City was created and built. And so he did this sort of translation of an ancient forest, of a primordial forest within an urban setting. Of course, calling attention to the ecological shift that we're currently living. And this was very early on because it was 1965. And like Spiral Jetty, we have no sound archives of time landscape. And this is something from inside the work, which is, of course, very important because we have different animals, various insects, species living here. But it's also interesting because the neighborhood around time landscape evolved. And so did our interaction with the work. So did the voices of people around the work. So did the noises of the cars around the work. And this is something that we lost and that is very difficult to rebuild. So thinking about the sound quality of a land artworks, this is really the core and the center of what we should look at now. How do we complement a work of land art with something more interested in, our place as listeners, but also creators of sounds around it. These are more recent works by Alan Sonfist, but it's just to give you an idea of his work. This is Rock Monument of New York City, which are earth drilling made in New York, 30 feet under the streets. It's actually very interesting because it's a map of New York City from underground. So I think it's starting in Canal Street, and then you go up to, I think it's 105 in the Upper East Side. And this is Leaves Frozen in Time. This is much more connected to the chance operation within his work. He would lay down the canvas, and then leaves were falling on it, and he just froze the piece with encaustic, having it in a very Cabinet of Curiosity-like setting. Those are seismic drawings. Those are very interesting because Alan Sonfist believed that the seismic activity of Earth was sound, and that we, as humans, need to pay attention and to listen to sounds like seismic drawing. So some of the people entering the space of the exhibition actually thought at the beginning that those were actual sound recordings, where it's more, seismic drawings made with the MIT at the time. So you have this kind of interesting interplay between the visual aspect of sound, the theoretical point of view of Alan, which is you need to pay attention to what surrounds us, especially the seismic activities, and something that we as humans we don't often experience seismic activities. So yeah, those are very minimalistic work. And then what I want to work on, I'm not yet, but that's a project, is a field recording of the New York Earth Room, which is a work by Walter de Maria that you are probably familiar with in Soho. It's basically an entire apartment filled with earth. And this is very interesting because there is this whole process of earth renewal, of cleaning, and most of the time, if you come, you will smell the earth very vividly, but you don't hear anything. And if you actually get closer to the earth, you will see small cracklings and insects going on the surface of earth. So this is something as Parogeli and has many work of land arts that is not documented from a sound perspective, but needs to be because it is a part of the work also. And now looking at more contemporary artists interested in sound and land art, Cyprien Gaillard is really one of my favorite artists. Sound is present in his work in various ways. Firstly, because he is really curious about contemporary music. So many of his pieces like Nightlife that he created in 2015 incorporates certain music that he listened to at a certain point in his life. And he's also collaborating with artists like Lara G or Pavel Miliakov to complement his own exhibition. So for instance, he was presenting last year an exhibition at the Palais de Tokyo in Paris and at Fondation Lafayette. And Pavel Miliakov came at the end of the exhibition to create a sort of sound experience within the setting of the exhibition, playing and doing some live music. So there's this very intimate connection of music present in various places in his work. Talking to you a bit more about Nightlife, it's a very intimate experience. It was for me the very first artwork that I saw that was kind of transcendental because it was filmed in various cities, in various settings, both paying attention to natural spaces like the jungles, but also urban setting. There's, at a certain point in the movie, a moment where you are seeing everything from a drone perspective, not drone music, but drone perspective, and you're going through this firework. It's not very long, it's 11 minutes, but everything is made possible with the music that Cyprien is using, which is a sort of very deep mental sound, and that he got from an Alton Ellis album, and he made it a bit more slow, focused on only certain lyrics, and you need to experience it. There is no video of no music recollection of what he creates, so I wish I could show you, but I can't. The second one I have an extract for is Ocean to Ocean. This is a bit later in Cyprien's work. It's more recent. But this is also interesting because from a very urban point of view, Cyprien was interested in the concept of ruins and what is urban ruins today. And so he documented both a sort of ancient geological past incorporated in a contemporary city like Moscow and in the subway. You will see it in the extract, and then something much more closer to us, which is the New York subway cars that were plunged into the Atlantic to create artificial reefs as part of a natural rehabilitation project. Yeah, those are images from the work, and this is, sorry, I need to do this again. This is an extract from Ocean to Ocean. Yes, and those are still images from the second part of the movie, focused on the rehabilitation project with the sort of recycling of a New York subway. And this is kind of very paradoxical because it's something very industrial within a land environment. And it was really a sort of debate about whether or not this specific project was useful or not to create new coral reefs around New York. Obviously. So this is the kind of cracks that he is interested in, the kind of friction that Cyprien is interested in. Yeah, that's another still from the work. And then the last artist that I wanted to talk to you about from a sound perspective is Pierre Huyghe, and especially the work called Kamata that was recently created and exhibited at the Pinot collection in Venice. This is a very interesting work because it uses sound, again, like Cyprien, in various ways. The concept of Kamata is to use AI within the space of the exhibition to influence the way you are perceiving the artwork in live. So you have, like Robert Smithson, a sort of non-sight experience that make the artwork very dynamic because it's evolving through human presence in the exhibition space. And so what Pierre Huyghe did is that he found in the desert this skeleton, this person dead right in the middle of nowhere. And he is drawing a lot of attention towards it through technology. He's using HD cameras with mechanical arms that are displacing some of the elements like a ritual. And sound within this piece is very interesting because you only hear the small gesture of the robotic arms. So you're plunged into this atmospheric, almost silent desert. And the only thing you hear is something that is very remote to the actual site, which is technology, robot, mechanics. So there's this very interesting contrast of sound. Like Cyprien, he is interested in the concept of ruins and also the post-human world. Yes, that's the last. And the camera is moving around the skeleton and the arms as a sort of auto-generative work of art when you are walking into the exhibition. There you go.